The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that makes your heart beat louder than your footsteps. The desert wind carried a soft chill, brushing against the wooden porch where a single lantern burned low, casting shadows across the worn boards. She stood there trembling, her hands gripping the folds of her dress as though she could hold herself together if she clutched hard enough. Her voice was raw, breaking through the still air, pleading with every ounce of fear and hope left in her soul. "I can be a good wife," she whispered, her words shaking like fragile glass. "Just let me live." The cowboy stopped where he was, his boots pressing into the dirt with a sound that felt far too loud for the moment. He didn't move closer. Instead, he reached slowly for the brim of his hat, taking it off as though to honor the weight of what she had just said. His face was shadowed, unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something caught between pity, doubt, and a storm he hadn't yet named. He turned the hat slowly in his hands, and for a moment the world seemed to wait on what he would say next. But the truth was, neither of them had reached this point by accident. Her life had been marked by long days of labor and nights of quiet endurance. The kind of life where every smile had to be earned and every breath felt like a second chance. She had learned to obey, to bow her head, to play the part of someone who never dared to want more. But tonight, desperation had stripped her of that silence. Tonight, she was fighting with nothing but words, and words alone can be sharper than steel when the heart is pressed against a wall. The cowboy, on the other hand, carried his own burdens, though he never spoke of them. Folks in town whispered about him, how he lived on the edge of law and outlaw, how he had a past carved with scars no one dared ask about. He was a man who knew both mercy and cruelty, and nobody could ever predict which hand he might deal on any given day. He had seen the world in its darkest corners, and maybe that's why he had stopped here, listening to her instead of walking away. Her voice quivered again, louder this time, carried by the wind like a prayer begging for an answer. "Please," she said, "I'll do anything. I can be the kind of woman you need me to be. Just don't take my life from me." There was no pride left in her tone, no mask to cover the raw edge of survival. It was not romance she was offering, not some dreamy promise of devotion. It was a bargain, a plea made in the shadow of fear. The cowboy tilted his head slightly, studying her. He looked at the lantern glow on her face, the way her eyes glistened, with the kind of tears that sting but never fall. He let out a slow breath, steady and heavy, the kind that made the air feel thick around them. For a moment, his silence was more frightening than any gun he could have drawn. Silence can crush a soul when it hangs too long. She thought back to the moments that had brought her here, the endless days of walking on eggshells, of being told her life wasn't her own, of choices ripped away before she could even hold them. She thought about the weight of promises broken, the sharp bite of betrayal, the feeling of being trapped in a world where no one cared whether she breathed another day. And now, in front of this cowboy whose eyes hid more than they revealed, she found herself offering the only thing she could, her willingness to live on any terms but her own. He placed the hat against his chest, his fingers brushing along the rim as though the leather could steady him. The quiet stretched longer until even the crickets seemed to hush. There was something almost reverent in the way he held himself, as though her words had touched a place deep within him that he had long buried. He opened his mouth, but then closed it again, unsure if he had the right to answer her plea. The night grew colder. The lantern flame flickered as the wind picked up, shadows stretching long across the porch, bending like ghosts reaching toward them. She took a small step forward, her body trembling but her voice firmer than before. "I don't want to die," she said, her eyes locked on his. "I just want a chance. Even if it means giving up everything else, just let me live." The cowboy's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was caught between two worlds, the hardened shell of a man who had seen too much, and the faint echo of someone who once believed in second chances. He had heard plenty of bargains in his life, but this one carried a weight different from gold or land or promises of loyalty. This was life itself, raw and trembling in front of him. He shifted his stance, sliding his thumb across the brim of his hat. For the first time, his eyes softened, not enough to promise safety, but enough to show he had heard her. The kind of look that could mean mercy, or could mean nothing at all. He drew in another breath, slow and deliberate, and the sound of it filled the night like thunder waiting to strike. She waited, her heart pounding so loud she thought he might hear it from where he stood. Every second felt like a lifetime, every beat of silence a verdict that had not yet been spoken. And then he lifted his gaze toward her, his lips parting as though to speak, but he didn't. He just placed his hat back on his head, pulling it low enough to shadow his eyes once more. He turned slightly, the leather of his boots creaking against the porch. The air grew heavier, the tension sharper, as she realized she didn't yet know whether his silence meant her salvation or her doom. Her hands tightened around her dress, her knees weak beneath her, but she stood tall because falling would mean surrender, and she couldn't surrender. Not now. Not when the line between life and death was balanced on the weight of his next step. The cowboy lingered, his figure caught between the dim glow of the lantern and the vast darkness of the desert night. The brim of his hat cast his face in shadow, and his voice, if he would ever let it come, remained trapped in the silence between them. The moment stretched long enough to break a heart, and then, with nothing more than the soft scrape of boots against wood, he turned his back and began to walk away. Her breath caught in her throat, her body trembling with the terror of what that choice meant. Was he sparing her? Was he abandoning her? Or was this only the beginning of a fate she could not yet imagine? The porch lantern flickered one last time, and the night swallowed them both in silence, leaving the question hanging in the air. Had her plea reached the heart of a man who could save her, or had it fallen into the dust where mercy never grows? The desert night swallowed him as he walked away, his shadow thinning until it was only a faint outline against the horizon. She stood frozen on the porch, her chest tight with fear and confusion. The lantern burned low, flickering like it too might give out at any second. Every sound the wind shifting through the dry grass, the faint cry of a coyote in the distance made her flinch. She didn't know if he was leaving for good or if he would circle back when she least expected it. Her heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing. She wanted to collapse, to sink into the wooden boards and let the weight of everything crush her, but she didn't dare. Survival meant standing, even when her knees threatened to give way. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "He heard me. He had to have heard me." But the silence of the desert gave her no answer. Behind her, the small house loomed. Its walls were thin, its roof patched too many times to keep out the wind, yet it was the only shelter she had. She glanced over her shoulder at the door, half tempted to bolt inside and lock it, though she knew a door wouldn't stop a man like him if he decided to return. She lingered there on the porch instead, listening to the fading sound of boots crunching dirt, clinging to each step until it was gone completely. Her mind spun with memories that refused to stay buried. She had not always been desperate. Once she had believed in promises, in dreams spun under starlight and whispered in the dark. She had believed that if she worked hard enough, obeyed enough, sacrificed enough, life would eventually repay her. But years had stripped those illusions, leaving her with nothing but the raw will to keep breathing. And now all of it had come. To this moment, the plea of a woman who had nothing left to bargain but her life. The cowboy had unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. There was danger in him, yes, but also something else. The way he had paused, the way he had held his had against his chest, it wasn't the gesture of a man entirely hardened. He could have laughed at her, mocked her weakness, or ended her plea with steel and smoke. Instead, he had listened. And that was what haunted her most. She stepped back into the house, closing the door with a soft creak. The small room smelled faintly of dust and kerosene. A table sat in the center, its surface scarred by years of use, and a single chair leaned crookedly against it. On the wall hung a faded picture of a family that no longer existed, their smiles frozen in time, untouched by the sorrow that had followed. She touched the frame lightly, her fingers tracing the outlines of faces she could barely remember without pain. The house was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. She tried to steady herself, to think of what tomorrow might bring, but tomorrow had always been uncertain. She moved toward the narrow bed in the corner and sat on its edge, the springs groaning beneath her weight. Her hands clenched in her lap, twisting the fabric of her dress as she replayed the night over and over again. What if he came back? What if he decided her words were not enough? Outside, the desert stretched vast and merciless. There was nowhere to run, no path that didn't lead into more emptiness. That was the cruelest part of it all. She was trapped not only by circumstance, but by the land itself. The isolation was a cage, the horizon its bars. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes, wishing for a moment she could vanish into a life where choices were hers to make. The cowboy's figure rose again in her mind. The way his silence had carried more weight than any words. Who was he, really? The town whispered plenty stories of a man who lived between law and lawlessness, who carried secrets in the scars across his hands. Some said he had once been a rancher. Others swore he had ridden with men who robbed trains and vanished into the hills. But no one really knew. And now she found herself caught in the orbit of his presence, her life tangled in a story she didn't fully understand. As the night stretched on, sleep refused to come. She lay awake, staring at the low ceiling, her mind restless with questions that had no answers. What if he had taken pity? What if he had seen something in her worth sparing? Or worse, what if he was testing her, waiting to see how far she would bend before she broke? The uncertainty gnawed at her more than fear itself. Hours later, when dawn began to brush the sky with pale light, she rose and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of sage and dust. The world looked calmer under the morning sun, but her heart carried the same storm. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of him, but the land stretched empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching in silence, waiting for something she didn't yet understand. She moved to the well, drawing water with tired hands, and tried to lose herself in the rhythm of simple tasks. The bucket creaked as she pulled it up, the rope rough against her skin. She poured the water into a tin basin, splashing her face with the coldness that made her gasp. For a moment, it grounded her, reminding her she was still here, still breathing. But the weight of last night lingered. Every sound made her glance over her shoulder. Every gust of wind stirred the fear that he had returned. She told herself she had to be ready for mercy or for cruelty. She didn't know which. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. She worked the land as best she could, tending to the small patch of dry earth that clung stubbornly to life. Her hands ached, her back bent under the sun, but she welcomed the pain. Pain was simple. Pain was easier to endure than waiting. As the shadows grew long again, she returned to the porch, her eyes fixed on the same horizon where he had disappeared. The memory of his voice, or rather, the lack of it, echoed in her mind. Silence had never spoken so loudly. She sat there until the lantern needed lighting, until the desert once again wrapped itself in darkness. And when the night grew still, she whispered the words she had spoken before, as though repeating them might keep her safe. I can be a good wife. Just let me live. But the wind carried them away, leaving her with nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat and the unanswered question that would not let her rest. What had the cowboy truly decided? The sound of his boots on the dirt still echoed in her mind long after he had vanished into the dark. She stayed there on the porch, frozen in place, clutching the wooden railing as though it might steady the storm inside her chest. Every moment stretched like a thread about to snap. His silence had been heavier than a bullet, his steps slower than judgment, and when he finally turned his back, she wasn't sure if she should breathe in relief or collapse from fear. The night pressed down, and the lantern flame trembled in the desert wind. She could taste the dust in the air, bitter and dry, clinging to her tongue as though even the earth itself was warning her not to hope. For a while, she stood perfectly still, listening, waiting to hear if he would come back. But the silence of the land offered no clue, no answer, no promise of safety. She stepped inside the house, shutting the door with careful hands. It wasn't much of a home, just four walls patched with effort and sorrow, but it was all she had. The table in the middle was scarred from years of use, the bed in the corner sagged from weight it had carried too long, and the faded picture on the wall reminded her of what had been stolen. Every object carried a memory, and every memory was a wound. Her body wanted rest, but her mind wouldn't let her. She lay on the bed with her eyes wide open, replaying the moment on the porch again and again. His hand on the brim of his hat, his silence stretching into something unbearable, the way he had walked away without a word. That silence was what frightened her most. Silence could mean mercy. Silence could mean punishment. Silence could mean he was coming back, just not yet. She thought about how she had gotten here, about the long road of choices she had never been allowed to make. Her life had been mapped by others, shaped by demands she couldn't refuse. Every step she had taken was shadowed by the weight of fear, every breath measured against what it might cost her. She had learned how to keep her head low, how to swallow her own voice, how to live quietly enough not to draw attention. But something in her had broken that night, something too desperate to stay quiet. The words had spilled out before she could stop them. "I can be a good wife, just let me live." The cowboy had been a stranger and not a stranger. People whispered about him in town, how he was both feared and respected, how no one ever truly knew what side of the law he walked on. Some said he had lost everything and carried that grief in the shadows of his eyes. Others swore he had taken lives and carried no shame for it. He was the kind of man who moved through the world with a weight no one could name. And now, for reasons she couldn't understand, her life rested in his hands. When dawn came, she rose with a heaviness that clung to her bones. The desert stretched out around her, wide and merciless, the horizon sharp against the pale sky. She drew water from the well, her hands raw against the rope, her body moving through the rhythm of survival. Each task grounded her, but each one also reminded her of how fragile this life was. A single choice from him, and it could all be taken away. As the day wore on, she thought about the land itself. It was unforgiving, cracked with drought, but it still carried life and stubborn patches of green. She saw herself in that stubbornness, clinging to whatever scraps of hope she could. She bent to the soil, her hands pressing into the dirt, telling herself that as long as she worked, as long as she kept moving, she was still alive. But even then, his presence lingered like a shadow. Across the sun, she could not forget the way he had looked at her. His eyes had not been cruel, but they had not been gentle either. They had held something she couldn't read, something locked away behind the weathered face of a man who had seen too much. She wondered if he had once known mercy, if there had been someone who softened him before the world turned hard. And she wondered if that part of him was the only thing that had kept her alive last night. When evening fell, she returned to the porch, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The same place where he had disappeared now seemed to pull at her, as though the land itself carried his silence back to her. She lit the lantern again, its glow trembling in the wind, and sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The words replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't escape. I can be a good wife. Just let me live. She hated herself for saying it, for offering her life like a bargain. But she hated more the thought that it might not have been enough. As darkness thickened, she thought she heard movement in the distance. A horse maybe, or boots on the dirt, though it could have been nothing more than the desert shifting under its own weight. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she held her breath, waiting, listening, but nothing came. Only silence. Sleep refused her again that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, every creak of the wood making her jump, every gust of wind making her wonder if he was out there, watching. Her mind spun with questions she could never answer. Why had he stopped to listen? Why had he walked away? And why, even now, did it feel like the story between them wasn't over? By morning, her body ached from exhaustion, but she pushed herself into motion. She boiled water for coffee, though she barely tasted it. She tended to the small patch of earth outside, though the soil yielded little. She moved through each task with her mind elsewhere, caught between fear of his return and fear of his absence. Because as much as she dreaded seeing him again, she dreaded more the idea that she might never know what he had decided. The town was too far to walk without risk, and even if she went, what would she say? That a man had stood on her porch and listened while she begged for her life? That his silence haunted her more than any threat could? No one would believe her. Or worse, they would believe her and call her weak. In this land, weakness was something you buried, not something you confessed. By the third night, the waiting had become unbearable. She sat on the porch again, lantern lit, staring out into the endless dark. The desert air was cool, the stars sharp against the sky, and the silence pressed in thicker than ever. She whispered again, not knowing if anyone could hear, not knowing if the words mattered. Please, just let me live. And somewhere in the dark, though she couldn't see him, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. The fourth night came with no sign of him, yet his absence weighed as heavily as his presence had. She sat on the porch again, her lantern throwing weak light across the boards, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though the desert might finally surrender its secrets. The silence pressed down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. Every sound of the wind, every shift in the earth, made her wonder if this was the moment he would return. She hated the waiting, hated how powerless it made her feel, but even more, she hated the thought that she might never know what choice he had made. The conflict inside her grew sharper. If he truly meant to leave her, why did she feel as though he still lingered somewhere nearby? The desert was wide, yet it carried whispers. People like him never walked away for good. They circled, they watched, they waited for the moment when silence could cut deepest. She thought she saw him once in the distance, just a shadow moving along the ridge, but when she blinked, it was gone. Perhaps it was only her mind playing cruel tricks. Her days became a careful dance between survival and dread. The chores kept her hands busy but could not quiet her thoughts. Every time she bent to tend the dry earth, she thought of how fragile life was, how easily it could be taken. Every time she drew water from the well, she imagined a voice behind her, low and steady, reminding her that mercy was never promised. The cowboy lived in her mind now, whether he was there or not, but she was not the only one caught in conflict. Out beyond the hills, he sat by a small fire, staring into the flames with eyes that carried more weight than sleep could ease. He replayed her words again and again. I can be a good wife, just let me live. He had heard bargains before, pleas shouted in fear, promises whispered with trembling lips. Most of them had been lies, desperate last words that turned hollow the moment the danger passed. Yet something in her voice lingered with him. It wasn't only fear. It was the raw edge of truth, the kind that slips free when there's nothing left to lose. He leaned back against the rock. His hat tipped low over his brow, but rest never came. Memories pulled at him, sharp as thorns. A woman's face from long ago, a promise he could not keep, a life that had been lost because he had turned his back too soon. He told himself he was not that man anymore, but the past had a way of carving itself deep into the soul. Maybe that was why he hadn't raised his hand against her. Maybe that was why he couldn't yet walk away completely. The desert offered no comfort, only the endless weight of choices left unspoken. He knew if he returned, it would not be to bring peace. His very presence carried danger, and yet he could not stop thinking of her voice. Her eyes lit by the lantern glow, her plea twisting into his chest like a blade. She was alive because of his silence, but silence was not a promise. Back at the house, she began to sense something shifting inside herself. Fear still held her, but beneath it stirred something else. Defiance. She told herself that if he came again, she would not beg a second time. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Survival has no pride. Survival bends the soul until all that matters is the next breath. Still, the thought of facing him again set her jaw tight. She could not live forever as a shadow of her own fear. Days slipped by, and with them came whispers from town. A rider stopped by the well one morning, a man she barely knew, and spoke of trouble brewing. A rancher had gone missing. Livestock slaughtered without cause. Tracks in the dirt leading nowhere. And through it all, rumors of the cowboy sightings. Near the river, a shadow moving through canyons, a name spoken with equal parts fear and respect. She listened quietly, her heart pounding, knowing without doubt that he was near. At night, the dreams came. She saw herself standing on the porch again, lantern in hand, but this time when she begged, he did not remain silent. In the dream, he spoke, though the words were always just beyond her hearing. She would wake with her hands clutching the blanket, her throat raw from whispering his name, though she had never dared to speak it aloud. The tension between them had become a living thing, stretched tight across the desert. She did not know if it would snap in violence or mercy, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he came again. And perhaps, she thought, part of her wanted him to. For what is worse, the fear of a man who might return, or the silence of never knowing if he will? The cowboy, too, felt that pull. He rode the edge of decision, circling her land at a distance, unseen but never far. He told himself it was caution, told himself he needed to be sure. But the truth was simpler. He could not stay away. Her words had carved into him, stirring the part of himself he had buried beneath years of dust and steel. He remembered another plea, long ago, one he had ignored. He had carried that silence with him ever since, heavy as stone. Maybe this time, he told himself, he was listening for a reason. As the nights grew colder, the conflict deepened. She began leaving the lantern burning longer, its glow stretching into the desert as though daring him to come back. She told herself it was only habit, but in her heart she knew she was sending a signal, whether she meant to or not. And somewhere out in the dark, he saw that light steady against the night, calling him closer. Neither of them knew what would come when they finally met again. But the desert has a way of drawing people back to the same ground, of testing the weight of choices not yet made. And so they waited, she on her porch, clinging to hope and dread in equal measure, and he in the shadows, carrying the silence of a man torn between the past and the present. The story between them was not finished. It was only beginning, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. The nights grew longer, heavier, as though the desert itself knew something was about to break. She no longer asked herself if he would return. She only wondered when. Each evening she lit the lantern, her hand trembling slightly as the flame caught, and she set it on the porch like a beacon. Sometimes she hated herself for doing it, but she couldn't stop. The light was both a warning and an invitation, a fragile sign of life that could be seen for miles. Word from the town traveled slowly, carried by riders who stopped at the well or passed by with news they shouldn't have shared. More cattle had been taken, another family gone missing, and each whisper carried his name like a shadow. Some said he was the cause. Others swore he was the only one who could stop it. But the truth lay somewhere in between, tangled in secrets she could only guess at. Every story about him added another weight to her fear, but also deepened the pull he had on her thoughts. She started to feel eyes on her even in the daylight. While she worked the soil, she would stop suddenly, convinced someone was watching from the ridge. At the well, the rope burned her hands when she thought she heard boots in the dirt behind her. At night, she dreamed of footsteps outside the door, so real that she would sit up in bed, clutching the blanket, straining to hear. Yet every time she opened the door, only the empty desert waited. But he was there. Out beyond the hills, he rode silently, circling her land, drawn closer each night. He told himself it was only caution, but he knew better. Her words still echoed, raw and desperate. "I can be a good wife. Just let me live." He hadn't answered then, and that silence grew heavier each day. He remembered other silences, moments when he had walked away, only to carry regret in his saddle for years. He told himself he would not repeat the past. But he didn't yet know what choice the future demanded of him. As the days bled into one another, tension coiled tight between them, though neither spoke a word. She grew restless, unable to bear the waiting. The missing rancher haunted her. The stories of slaughter twisted in her mind until she wondered if the land itself was cursed. Sometimes she thought she saw movement at the edge of her fields, horses' outline in the moonlight, the faint glint of steel. Other times it was only the wind, but her heart didn't know the difference. One evening, as the sky turned red with the last light of day, she heard hoofbeats in the distance. Slow at first, steady, deliberate. Her hands froze over the bucket she had just drawn from the well, water spilling onto the dry earth. The sound grew closer, measured and sure, until it filled the silence with a rhythm that made her chest tighten. She stood rooted to the spot, staring at the horizon, waiting for the figure to appear. When he finally came into view, the air itself seemed to stop moving. He rode with his hat low, his shoulders heavy, the dust rising behind him like a shroud. She felt both terror and a strange relief, as though the moment she had feared most had finally arrived. She stepped back toward the porch, her pulse racing, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. He dismounted without a word, his boots striking the dirt like thunder in the stillness. His shadow stretched long in the lantern glow, reaching toward her as though it carried its own intent. She gripped the railing to steady herself, forcing her voice not to tremble, but no words came. He stood there, silent again, his gaze fixed on her, and the weight of that silence was unbearable. The desert around them held its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, sharp and lonely, then fell quiet. The night seemed to close. In the stars watching from above as though they too waited for what would happen next. She felt the words clawing at her throat. The same plea she had spoken before, but she swallowed them back. This time, she told herself, she would not beg. But when his hand brushed against the brim of his hat, the gesture slow and deliberate, her knees nearly gave way. It was not cruelty in his eyes nor mercy, but something darker, something unresolved. And it pulled her deeper into his silence. He stepped closer, the boards of the porch groaning beneath his weight, and the lantern flame flickered as though it feared being blown out. She could smell the dust on him, the faint trace of smoke, and behind it all something she couldn't name, a past carried like a cloak. His presence filled the space between them, pressing on her until every breath felt stolen. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed narrowed to the two of them, bound by the plea she had made and the silence he had kept. And then, faintly, from the horizon behind him, came another sound riders, distant but approaching fast. The rhythm of many hoofbeats, sharp against the earth, breaking the fragile stillness. Her eyes widened, darting past him into the night, but his gaze never left her. He knew who was coming. He knew what it meant. And she understood then that whatever choice he had to make, it would happen here, on this porch. Under the cold desert stars, the hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until the ground itself seemed to tremble. The lantern flame quivered, shadows leaping across the walls of the house, and the night thickened with the weight of what was about to unfold. She clutched the railing tighter, her heart racing, her breath shallow. The cowboy remained still, his silence deeper than ever, but his hand shifted just slightly toward the brim of his hat again, as though bracing himself for the moment to come. Conflict that had circled for nights, for years, for lifetimes, was closing in. And the desert itself seemed to wait, holding all its breath for the moment when silence would finally shatter. The riders crested the ridge like a dark wave, their silhouettes cut against the stars. The ground trembled with their approach, and the lantern on the porch shook, throwing a restless pattern of light across the boards. She didn't move. He didn't either. For a long breath, they simply faced one another, as if the world had narrowed to a single choice neither had yet dared to name. Then he spoke at last, his voice low and steady, like a door easing open after years of being stuck. "When they get here, don't run," he said. "Whatever happens, stay in the light." It was the first time she had heard his voice, and it surprised her that it held no threat, only a kind of tired clarity. The riders fanned out in the yard, a ragged circle closing fast. She counted 6, then 7, then more faces she recognized from the town and the far ranches. The one in front, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw, drew up his horse and stared from her to the cowboy. "Evening," he said, his tone dry as dust. "We've been looking for you." She clutched the railing, feeling a rush of heat and cold all at once. So it was true he had been part of the whispers. The missing rancher, the cattle, the odd tracks that led nowhere. The cowboy didn't flinch. He lifted his chin slightly, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. "You want answers," he said. "Start where the trail forks." The scar-jawed man glanced at her, then back at him. "We'll start with the missing," he said. "Rancher's hands found his coat by the river. Folks say you were seen near there." "Was," the cowboy answered. "And I left a mark to point you further down, past the bend where the reeds break twice." "Why would you help?" Someone behind the leader scoffed. "You're the one we heard about." "Because the man you're after runs with a different shadow," the cowboy said. He nodded toward the far hills. 3 miles north, old line shack. He put the coat there after dark to turn your eyes the wrong way. He thinks the desert will erase his tracks by morning. The group shifted. Confusion moved through them like a low wind. She swallowed hard, listening, feeling the tight coil in her chest loosen just enough to breathe. The leader's gaze hardened. "You got proof?" The cowboy motioned to his saddlebag. Took this off his horse when he left the river to double back. He unbuckled the flap and tossed a torn strip of leather to the man in front. The brand on it was clear under the lantern light, one of the town's well-known marks. He traded stolen cattle for silence and used the missing rancher to cover the trail. "I followed him 2 nights, waiting for him to slip. He was headed here next." A murmur ran through the riders. One of them cursed under his breath. Another looked toward the north, where the land lay black and wide. The leader turned the branded leather in his hands, jaw working. "Why here?" he asked quietly. The cowboy's eyes flicked toward her, then back. Because she's alone. Because scaring the living makes the dead harder to find. Because if you keep a lantern burning night after night, a different kind of man thinks it's easy to blow out. Her stomach twisted. So the fear that had haunted her porch wasn't just in her head. It had been seen, measured, used. The thought made her grip the railing harder, but it also sparked something hotter than fear. Something close to anger at being made into bait by a stranger's choices. The leader slid off his horse. "You say?" "He's at the line shack," he said to the cowboy. "You're coming with us?" "I will," the cowboy said. "But she stays in the light." His tone carried a finality that made the men glance at one another. The leader nodded once. "Two of you stay," he ordered, motioning to a pair at the edge of the circle. "No one goes inside, no one goes near the door. Keep the porch lit." Then to the cowboy, "You ride with me." For a second, he lingered, eyes on her. The night hummed with things unsaid. She found her voice, thin but steady. "Why did you walk away that first night?" she asked. "When I begged." His hat brim cast half his face in shadow, but she saw the flicker there, the start of an answer he didn't want to give. "Because I heard someone else's voice inside yours," he said at last. "One I didn't listen to long ago." He touched the brim, a brief, spared gesture. "I listened this time." He swung into the saddle, and the riders wheeled as one, thundering toward the north. Dust lifted and rolled and then settled again. The yard fell quiet, save for the horses left behind and the breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The two men dismounted awkwardly, all elbows and eyes. They kept their distance. "One. Check the lantern, trimming the wick." "Keep it bright," she said without meaning to. He only nodded. For a while there was nothing but the soft rasp of horses shifting and the low voices of the guards, too careful to draw near. She stayed where she was, palms pressed to the rail, watching the dark line of hills as if she could will the riders back faster. Time stretched thin. The desert seemed to hover between silence and sound, like a held note. She thought of every night she had waited, and how the waiting itself had carved lines on her heart. She thought of the words she had spoken, "I can be a good wife, just let me live," and how they had tasted like ash on her tongue. She had offered survival, because no one had ever offered her a choice. Standing on that porch now, she wondered what a choice might feel like if it was hers alone. Hoofbeats returned just before dawn, faint at first, then gathering like rain. The riders came in a rough line, dust ghosts at the edge of morning. The leader rode in front again. Behind him, a second rider led a horse with a slumped figure bound upright in the saddle. Even from a distance, she knew it wasn't the cowboy who wore those ropes. They pulled up in the yard, breath steaming in the cool light. The bound man's face was ashen, his eyes flat and sullen. The leader dismounted and jerked his head toward the prisoner. "Foreman from the East Ranch," he said. He set the cattle runs and staged the missing to cover it. "Rancher's alive, hurt, but breathing. We found him hogtied behind the line shack with water just out of reach. He spat in the dirt. Would have died by noon if we were slower." She stared at the man who had turned her nights into terror. He kept his eyes down, jaw clenched. She felt a sharp, clean anger cut through her fear. Not wild, not loud, just steady. The guards shifted, as if they could feel it too. On another horse, the cowboy sat quiet, dust covering his coat. His silence different, now less a wall, more a rest after a long road. The leader tipped his hat toward her. "You kept that lantern lit," he said. "Helped us see what we needed to see." She didn't know how to answer that. She had lit it out of fear, out of helpless waiting. The idea that it had been a signal for truth seemed too large to hold. They led the prisoner away, bound for the town and a sheriff who would not be kind. She watched until the yard emptied again, until only the cowboy remained, still and patient as the dawn unfolded. When they were alone, he dismounted and climbed the first step of the porch. He didn't come closer. "You were never my judge," she said, before he could speak. "But I thought you were. I thought your silence meant I wasn't worth an answer." She swallowed, surprised to hear the steadiness in her own tone. "That wasn't true." "No," he said, "it wasn't." He looked past her to the little room, the scarred table, the picture on the wall. "You kept this place going when the land said not to. That takes a different kind of courage than folks like me are taught." She let that sit a moment. Then, almost shyly, she said, "The rancher, he'll be all right? He'll live." The cowboy said, "He'll have a story to tell. Might be the town listens different after this." He rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat, a habit she had come to recognize as thought. "And you?" She didn't have a ready answer. For so long, the only future she could see was surviving the night in front of her. Now the horizon looked wider, not easy, but open. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I won't. Beg to be a good wife to stay alive again. If I ever speak those words, it will be to someone who asks nothing of me I don't choose to give." He nodded as if he'd been waiting to hear exactly that. "There's a town meeting tomorrow," he said after a beat. "About the cattle, the foreman, the missing. They'll need truth told plain. If you want, I'll ride with you as far as the church and wait outside." She thought about walking into town under a clean sky, not because she was running from something, but because she was part of what came next: answers, accountability, a new way to be seen. "All right," she said, "ride with me as far as the church." They let the morning soak the yard. The light moved slowly across the boards, across the lantern that had kept its small vigil for so many nights. He fixed the hinge on her door. Without being asked, a quiet clink and turn of the screwdriver, the kind of help that didn't weigh. She cooked coffee and poured him a tin cup. They stood near the railing, not touching, facing the same stretch of land. Before he left, he set the cup down and turned to her. "About that first night," he said. "You asked for a life you could keep. That wasn't a bargain. It was a promise to yourself. Don't forget who made it." "I won't," she said. And she knew she meant it. He tipped his hat again, then swung into the saddle. He didn't look back as he rode off, but he didn't ride far. She could see him pause on the ridge, a lone figure against the brightening sky, then angle toward the road that would take them both into town by different paths. She smiled at that, a small, real thing. The next day, the church was full. The rancher arrived with his arm in a sling, his voice rough but strong. The leader laid out the branded leather, the map of tracks, the truth that had been bent and then set straight. People listened, really listened. When it was her turn, she stood and spoke about fear, about the lantern, about how a voice can be taken from a person until it's no louder than a breath, and how it can come back one word at a time. No one called her weak. No one told her to be quiet. The room held her words, and in that holding, something old broke and something new took root. Afterward, she stepped out into the light. The cowboy waited beneath the cottonwood outside the church, reins looped over one hand. He didn't ask what had been said. He could see it in her face. "You're different," he observed. "I'm the same," she said. "But I remember myself now." He smiled, faint and genuine. "That's different enough." They walked to the edge of town together. He told her he'd head south, to rivers where the water ran strong even in heat, to places where a man could put down a weight, or pick up a new one. She told him she might hire help for the land, start small again, keep the porch light for herself instead of for fear. Neither asked anything from the other. It felt right that way. When they parted, there were no promises. Only a look that said, they knew what had been carried through the dark to reach this morning. A look that said mercy isn't weakness and silence can be broken. A look that said survival is not the same as surrender. That evening, back at her place, she lit the lantern. Out of habit, and then, after a moment, blew it out. The desert held its breath in the sudden soft dark, and she realized she wasn't afraid of it anymore. The stars were enough. The house was enough. Her own steady heartbeat was enough. She leaned against the porch rail and watched the horizon. Somewhere far off, a rider moved along a low ridge. Not toward her, not away, simply crossing the land with the patience of someone who had learned the worth of listening. She wished him well, then turned inside to the small room with the scarred table and the picture on the wall. She set the frame upright and smiled back at the faces that had once felt like ghosts. Tomorrow would bring work and dust and long hours. It would bring news from town, maybe a neighbor's knock, maybe a hand offered in decent trade. It would bring whatever it brought, and she would meet it standing. She had pleaded once, and the words had cut her to speak. Now she didn't need them. A good life, a good heart, a good wife, these were not bargains to be made in fear. They were choices, simple and plain, claimed in the light. And in the quiet that followed, the desert finally sounded like what it had always been. Not a cage, but a wide, open place where a person could breathe.